So, they're making another Pride and Prejudice.
Not another one?
Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and it's that time of year again. Netflix are having another go at Jane Austen.
I'd prefer open hostility.
According to rumours reported by the Daily Mail anyway, so take all of this with a bucket of salt. Still, let's talk about it. Early in October, rumours started sprouting about a new Pride and Prejudice adaptation allegedly in the works for Netflix. But at time of recording, there has not been an official announcement about this. These rumours were first reported by the Daily Mail on the 11th of October and then quickly picked up by other publications, including Deadline and Variety. At first, Daisy Edgar Jones was reported to have been cast as the protagonist Elizabeth Bennet, but the Mail has since changed that statement and is now claiming that Daisy Edgar Jones was offered the role but declined it. Dolly Alderton is reported to be writing the series. You might know her from her 2019 best-selling debut novel Everything I Know About Love. I don't know her at all, but that's very much a me problem. What I do know, however, is Pride and Prejudice. Excellent segue there, perfectly executed. I could be working on breakfast television. Anyway, Pride and Prejudice, the novel that has been delighting us for 211 years and counting. It's been adapted several times over the last century, with the most notable film adaptations being the one from 1940, starring Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier, and the 2005 one with Keira Knightley and Matthew Macfadyen. When you think of TV adaptations, it's the 1995 BBC miniseries that comes to mind first of all, with Jennifer Ehle and Colin Firth. However, and I only found this out while researching for this video, the BBC has a bit of a thing for Pride and Prejudice. Guess how many BBC TV adaptations there are overall? Don't cheat, no looking this up. Write your answer in the comments section if you're feeling brave enough. I'll give you a moment. And bear in mind this is counting television only, not including radio adaptations. So how many do you think there are? The answer is 6. In its history, the BBC has adapted Pride and Prejudice for television 6 times. In 1938, 1952, 1958, 1967, 1980 and 1995. At this point, presumably, they decided they'd achieved perfection and stopped making more. If you're of my generation, plus or minus a decade, you'll be most familiar with the 1995 BBC miniseries and the 2005 film, which is the most recent high-profile adaptation. But that came out nearly 20 years ago and is therefore old enough to be married off by Mrs. Bennet to the next available single gentleman of consequence. So, is it time for another Pride and Prejudice adaptation? Does Gen Z deserve their own... You know what I'm talking about. The answer is no. Go and drool over Colin Firth like the rest of us. Glad we got that sorted. Thank you for watching. Oh, alright, if you must. It's been nearly 20 years since the last movie adaptation and nearly 30 years since the last miniseries. Surely we deserve another one as a treat, right? The thing is, the way that we watch TV and movies has changed in the last decade. Ticket sales for cinemas dropped drastically in 2020. No idea why, I guess people just got fed up of overpriced popcorn, and they haven't recovered since. At the same time, the meteoric rise of subscription streaming services have made them a major player in the TV industry. Netflix, for example, sextupled. Is that even a real word? Anyway, there's 6 times more people with a paid Netflix subscription now than there were 10 years ago. I don't need to be rehashing this. Chances are you're already subscribed to Minervi. You know I can't see the script when you sit there. You could not care less, could you? Oh yes. Chances are what, Minerva? Chances are what? Give me a baby. Are you purring into the microphone? Is that what's happening now? Blah, 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 Netflix, 6 times more subscribers than they had a decade ago. Chances are you're already subscribed to Netflix or Amazon Prime or Disney Plus or Hulu. I admit I'm only vaguely aware of what Hulu is. As well as showing films and TV shows made by other companies, these streaming services also commission and produce their own content, both series and films. Films like, for example, the 2022 adaptation of Jane Austen's novel Persuasion that was produced and distributed by Netflix, starring Dakota Johnson as Anne Elliot.
Sometimes I have this dream that a giant octopus is sucking my face.
This production was not well received by critics and viewers, or indeed by me. The idea of making, especially a female character, clumsy, awkward, socially inept, and she falls over a lot, and then calling that a personality, it just doesn't work anymore in the year of our Lord 2022. I watched it on release day and I still bear the mental scars from that experience. In fact, if you want to watch my soul crumble before your very eyes, you can find the link to my review video of that atrocity in the description box. So now Netflix might be working on another Austen, and her fans online are not happy about it. I can't blame them after the nightmare that was Netflix's Persuasion, and I think we already have the perfect Pride and Prejudice in the 1995 adaptation. Even the BBC realized that and stopped making them, even though up to that point they were churning them out at a rate of about one a decade. The Pride and Prejudice market at this point is more than saturated, as well as all the adaptations I've just mentioned, which stay more or less faithful to the book. There's also a whole selection of modernized retellings which take the story of Pride and Prejudice and set it in a different time and place. Films like Bride and Prejudice or Fire Island, as well as the wildly successful YouTube adaptation, The Lizzie Bennet Diaries. These adaptations all put a twist on the original, and as such I like them a lot. It's the story we know and love, but also not. In fact, Netflix has announced that one such project is in the works, and that is an adaptation of Ibi Zoboi 2018 novel Pride, which is a young adult retelling of Pride and Prejudice set in modern-day New York. As far as I'm concerned, they can keep making those retellings. I love reading them, and I really enjoy watching them too. But in this video, we're talking about direct screen adaptations that at least aim to stay close to the book. No modern day New York or modern day anywhere else, we're back in Regency England and Netherfield Park is let it last. That raises once more the question that brought you all to this video: do we really need another Pride and Prejudice adaptation? It's easy for a big old nerd like me to say, one of these days these Philistines are going to realize Jane Austen wrote more than one book actually, or even, God forbid, when are Maria Edgeworth's novels finally getting their moment in the sun? The answer to that, by the way, is never. I enjoyed Belinda as much as the next pathetic nerd with no social life. But by the time a screenwriter actually manages to extract a film-worthy plot out of that book, there won't be much of the book left. Pride and Prejudice already has a film-worthy plot, which is presumably the reason it keeps getting made into films. But at this point it feels like a lazy choice. Like a decision made by people in a ballroom who have a historical drama slot to fill and they can't think of another book to adapt. Except maybe Wuthering Heights. But that's a whole other can of worms we're not even going to touch in this video. ITV went outside the box a little bit with their adaptation of Sanditon, which is one of Jane Austen's unfinished novels. This allowed them to take quite a lot of freedoms with what is really a very thin premise for a story, since there isn't much source material there to go on. So they got the best of both worlds. They could capitalize on the well-known name that is Jane Austen, while telling a story that's virtually unknown in the mainstream, and also putting their own spin on it. I wish Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus, whatever the hell Hulu is, would look at some less obvious choices for literary classics. There's several options even if we are sticking with Austen. We're long overdue a good Mansfield Park adaptation. I'm not a fan of the book. I've made a 40-minute video about how not a fan of the book I am if you want to watch me suffer through it. Now we actually get a bit where we spend an entire part of the novel inside Fanny's head, and unfortunately I find that quite boring. Link down below. But its potential for adaptation is undeniably there, in particular if you look at the story as a coming-of-age tale. Fanny Price tends to get overlooked as an Austen heroine because she's both quiet and passive. The plot of Mansfield Park sort of happens around her. She's much less proactive than Lizzie Bennet or Emma Woodhouse, for example. But that opens up the space to make a really good adaptation that focuses entirely on its heroine. If you're looking for a Jane Austen book to transform into a gritty historical drama, this is the one. It's low on the romance and has the potential to be high on the politics. It's the only Austen novel where we get a glimpse of not the working classes, God forbid, but the lower middle classes And I can see the BBC doing something really extraordinary with this novel. As for Netflix, they could have a lot of fun with a new adaptation of Northanger Abbey. All the crimes they committed in an attempt to modernize Persuasion could really work when applied to Northanger Abbey. Because unlike Anne Elliot, Catherine Morland could really work as a modern Gen Z heroine. You know I'm right, she'd be all over Book Talk. She's fun, she's relatable, she's a teenager on her first big holiday alone. This could be one hell of a summer adventure movie. Whereas Mansfield Park lends itself to a serious and historically well-informed BBC-style adaptation, Mansfield Park is the sort of book that you could take some liberties with to appeal to a young audience. It's the funniest of Austen's novels, featuring the youngest heroine and arguably the most modern love interest. You don't have to go full Bridgerton with it, but I can totally see a rom-com interpretation of it that's firmly rooted in the time period, but brings in a lot of modern elements as well. So much for my own Austen adaptation wish list, but classic literature adaptations don't have to be based on her books. Yes, other authors exist. There's been plenty of Victorian novels that have been adapted into high-profile films and TV shows lately, such as Around the World in 80 Days and David Copperfield. We've also seen Netflix in recent years making a success of 20th century classics like The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith and Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And the BBC, for example, adapted Nancy Mitford's The Pursuit of Love a few years back. And as I've previously alluded to in this video, there's a new Wuthering Heights in the making, for which director Emerald Fennell seemingly pulled the cast out of, a hat. There have been some really fantastic adaptations recently that are a bit out of the ordinary. The BBC did an excellent job with Gentleman Jack, which, while not being based on a novel, is of course a loose adaptation of a book, which is the real-life diary of the real-life Anne Lister. In 2017, Hulu, whatever the hell that is, broadcast the first series of Harlots, which was subsequently also shown on BBC Three. This is also technically a book adaptation, though in this case of a modern non-fiction book about sex workers in 18th century London. Both Harlots and Gentleman Jack were absolutely amazing, so do check those out if you haven't yet. And if you're craving a sexy historical drama that respects history but not at the price of fun. Both were sadly cancelled after a few series, but they're still worth watching. The BBC hasn't given up on book-inspired period drama though. In fact, the BBC hasn't given up on Pride and Prejudice, and it has recently announced an adaptation of the novel The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, which was published in 2020 and revolves around Mary Bennet. The press have been calling this a spin-off of Pride and Prejudice, but it isn't really. It's published fan fiction, and there's nothing wrong with that, but calling it a spin-off makes it sound like Jane Austen herself somehow signed off on this. This is certainly another avenue for TV companies to capitalize on the popularity of Pride and Prejudice without actually doing a direct adaptation of it. And I expect we'll see a lot more of those in the future. But I would also like to see more direct screen adaptations of classic novels. And there's so many to choose from. So, with that in mind, let's look at a few 19th century books that haven't yet been adapted to death and that I think are ripe for the picking. First, I'd love to see a new adaptation of the severely underrated The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, which is my favorite Bronte novel. I say new adaptation because apparently the BBC did one in 1996. Don't know how they found the time with all the other period dramas they were making in the mid-90s. I've not seen that adaptation. In fact, I didn't know of its existence until just now. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is surprisingly modern for a Victorian novel that's heavily steeped in Victorian values and morals. It's a heavy book and would make for a very serious and dark adaptation, but one that in the right hands could be extremely impactful. It's a book about the dark sides of relationships and one that touches on so many subjects that are relevant to the modern day viewer. It's a real shame that it's so often overlooked in favor of Jane Eyre or the ever-present pest that is Wuthering Heights. Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu is a pre-Dracula Victorian vampire novella that's been getting a good deal of attention on various book social media, but isn't as mainstream as, Dracula. It's a tiny little book with a bit of a predictable plot, but it has a lot of elements which I think would make it really well suited for a new dark fantasy adaptation. There's sexy lesbian vampires, deserted castles in the Alps, and so much drama. This book has been adapted a few times over the years, but never with a big budget attached. All the Twilight girlies are grown up now, and I know they'd be all over this. Finally, a Victorian novel that's super cinematic even as you read it. Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. It's one of the prime examples of the so-called sensation novel, a mid-19th century literary trend which produced very long books with twisty plots and salacious mysteries at their center. This one could be easily adapted as a gripping miniseries with all the twists and all the drama of the book, a crime mystery with maybe a bit of a psychological thriller edge. It features a unwilling but charismatic detective who's up against an equally charismatic opponent. And I can just picture this story unfolding over an 8 or 10 episode limited run series. So, do we need another Pride and Prejudice? No. Am I going to watch this one if and when it comes out? In vain I have struggled, against my better judgment, etc, etc. Of course I'm going to watch it. I watched that horrendous Persuasion adaptation, even though I knew it was probably going to be torture.
A giant octopus is sucking my face.
What can I say? I'm part of the problem. Thank you for watching. Bye.